Actually, I am a Christian, and indeed a Roman Catholic, so I do not expect history to be anything but a long defeat, though it contains, and in a legend may contain more clearly and movingly, some samples or glimpses of final victory. J.R.R. Tolkien in a letter to Amy Ronald, 15th of December, 1956. Tolkien was enamored with the northern spirit, which did not fight for ultimate victory, but for the victory of the day. In the Norse mythos, there is no hope for the final triumph of the life of man, or even most of the gods for that matter, as the great apocalypse of Ragnarok claims the lives of both. This awareness of impending doom gives the northern tales a unique flavor against their southern counterparts. Tolkien writes in The Monsters and the Critics, his monumental essay on Beowulf, that the southern gods are not the allies of men in their war against these or other monsters. The interest of the gods is in this or that man as part of their individual schemes, not as part of a great strategy that includes all good men as the infantry of battle. In Norse, at any rate, the gods are within time, doomed with their allies to death. Their battles with the monsters in the outer darkness. They gather heroes for the last defense. In the Norse understanding, gods and noble men fight together against the monsters, against the chaos, not to win in the ultimate sense, but because it is the valiant thing to do. Tolkien continues, "The northern gods, Kerr said, have an exultant extravagance in their warfare, which makes them more like Titans than Olympians. Only they are on the right side, though it is not the side that wins. The winning side is chaos and unreason, mythologically, the monsters. But the gods, who are defeated, think that defeat no refutation, and in their war, men are their chosen allies, able when heroic to share in this absolute resistance, perfect because without hope." At least in this vision of the final defeat of the humane and of the divine made in its image, and into the essential hostility of the gods and heroes on the one hand and the monsters on the other, we may suppose that pagan English and Norse imagination agreed. Now, if there is no hope of ultimate victory, then what reason does the northern hero have to fight on the side of the gods? Why fight an impossible fight? The answer is Valiance. The answer is justice, which is good for its own sake. The answer is that there is good in this world, and it is worth fighting for, even if it is only the good of today. Again, in The Monsters and the Critics, Tolkien says, "It is the strength of the northern mythological imagination that it faced this problem, put the monsters in the center, gave them victory but no honor, and found a potent but terrible solution in naked will and courage. So potent is it that while the older southern imagination has faded forever into literary ornament, the northern has power, as it were, to revive the spirit even in our own times. It can work, even as it did for the godless Viking, without gods, martial heroism as its own end. But we may remember that the poet of Beowulf saw clearly, the wages of heroism is death." The story of Beowulf is, to some degree, one of futility. In the end, Beowulf dies, and the Geats whom he led and protected would soon be conquered by its neighbors. It might be argued that Beowulf failed, but that surely is not what we are meant to get from the story. What we principally see is that Beowulf did what the northern hero is expected and lauded for doing. He secured the life, the festivity, and the human good of the mead halls against the encroaching winter for as long as he possibly could. As in a little circle of light about their halls, men with courage as their stay went forward to that battle with the hostile world and the offspring of the dark, which ends for all, even the kings and champions, in defeat. Now, our Beowulf poet, himself a Christian, is surely telling us something about the futility of mortal life. Tolkien explains, Beowulf is not then the hero of an heroic lay precisely. He has no enmeshed loyalties, nor hapless love. He is a man, and that for him and many is sufficient tragedy. The story of Beowulf is the story of all mortal heroes. They do heroic things and then they die. Their death does not erase their heroism, but their heroism does make their death significant, as they enter into the eternal realm of legend. Yet there is surely still a futility in this pagan hope, and our Christian poet of Beowulf was surely intentional about making this known, about making this experienced, even if he did not explicitly provide a solution in the poem. Tolkien, however, does identify that solution with his idea of the eucatastrophe. He explains the idea of eucatastrophe as follows in his essay on fairy stories. The consolation of fairy stories, the joy of the happy ending, or more correctly, of the good catastrophe, the sudden joyous turn, for there is no true end to any fairy tale. This joy, which is one of the things which fairy stories can produce supremely well, is not essentially escapist, nor fugitive. In its fairy tale or otherworld setting, it is a sudden and miraculous grace, never to be counted on to recur. It does not deny the discatastrophe of sorrow and failure. The possibility of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. It denies, in the face of much evidence if you will, universal final defeat, and insofar as Evangelium, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy, joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. Tolkien does not expect history to be anything but a long defeat, despite the many victories that we may experience along the way. Even as the Gospel tells of Christ, who suffered and died before entering his glory, so too we must meet with the terms of our mortality before the eucatastrophe of resurrection. And so too does Tolkien believe will be the affairs of world history. Things will become worse in the long run, until finally they become infinitely better with the unexpected, that is, unexpected except by faith, and happy turn of redemption. Although Tolkien knows this Christian hope, he recognizes that pagan futility is by no means erased with this revelation. He says, again in The Monsters and the Critics, Beowulf's author is still concerned primarily with man on earth, rehandling in a new perspective an ancient theme, that man, each man and all men, and all their works shall die, a theme no Christian need despise. This temporal defeat is real, but its reality is taken up by the eucatastrophe, and thus we may face death with finite futility because we have a glimpse of eternal goodness. Tolkien says that the tragedy of this great temporal defeat remains for a while poignant, but ceases to be finally important. It is no defeat, for the end of the world is part of the design of Metod, the arbiter who is above the mortal world. Beyond, there appears to be a possibility of eternal victory, or eternal defeat, and the real battle is between the soul and its adversaries. So the old monsters became images of the evil spirit or spirits, or rather, the evil spirits entered into the monsters and took visible shape in the hideous bodies of heathen imagination. Beowulf's poet, himself being a Christian, does not despair of death. He does not object to demonstrating the role that death plays in ending and even in wiping out finite pursuits. As a Christian, he finds this element of the northern mythos entirely palatable and even correct. However, what the Christian poet brings to the table is the ultimate hope that even in the catastrophe of death, we can expect to find, or at the very least hope to find, eucatastrophe, the happy turn. So, our Beowulf poet is not, as Tolkien points out, muddling up his Christian and pagan mythos, but he is rather bringing them together into something true, something that is truly Christian and profoundly powerful. A good way of thinking about this is to consider the Battle of Helm's Deep in the Two Towers. The men of Rohan, who are largely a stand-in for the Anglo-Saxons, stand against the monsters of chaos and darkness until the last free man would inevitably fall. If this played out, then this would be a northern story. However, Gandalf, arriving with the morning light, alongside the forces of nature rightly oriented, make it into a Christian story. We do not know where the road will take us in this life, but we can, as Tolkien says, despair of an event while maintaining belief in the value of doomed resistance. There are many examples of the long defeat and the role of eucatastrophe throughout Tolkien's writing, but we'll look at just a couple now from The Lord of the Rings. First, consider this statement of Galadriel concerning Celeborn. For the Lord of the Galadrim is accounted the wisest of the elves of Middle-earth, and a giver of gifts beyond the power of kings. He has dwelt in the west since the days of dawn, and I had dwelt with him years uncounted. For ere the fall of Nargothrond of Gondolin, I passed over the mountains, and together, through ages of the world, we have fought the long defeat. So there you have it, Tolkien directly working this idea of the long defeat into his narrative, and who better to recognize the reality of the long defeat than his long-lived elves. And if you have read through the Silmarillion, then you likely are already very aware of how this theme plays out throughout the course of his legendarium. The glories of the Elder Days are ruins and stories in the Third Age, and they far outshine what the latter has to offer. Things fade. Things get worse over time, but that is all the more reason for heroes to maintain valiance. As Aragorn says in The Two Towers, the Council of Gandalf was not founded on foreknowledge of safety, for himself or for others. There are some things that it is better to begin than to refuse, even though the end may be dark. And now we end with a word from Gandalf in the Council of Elrond. It is not despair, for despair is only for those who see the end beyond all doubt. We do not. It is wisdom to recognize necessity when all other courses have been weighed, though as folly it may appear to those who cling to false hope.